Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, with our ongoing series on marketing management, today also we would be talking on advertising. In previous session we discussed a lot and covered a lot under advertising, but we have more to learn, so we have decided to conduct another session. In today's session we would be discussing on advertising budget, advertising effectiveness, advertising agencies, social, ethical and regulatory aspects, as well as, if we will get time, we will discuss advertising versus sales promotion. And for this discussion we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Garima Gupta. Dr. Garima Gupta is Associate Professor in Faculty of Management Studies, Delhi University. So let's welcome our guest Dr. Garima Gupta and let's learn more about advertising. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you. Okay students, so today again we would be having a lecture on advertising. I'll give you a brief recall as to what all we covered in the first lecture. We talked about 5 main decision areas which comprise of the fundamentals of advertising, and we said that these are the 5 decision areas which are popularly known as 5 M's of advertising. They comprise of determination of advertising objectives, which is nothing but the mission. Second, deciding out on the message strategy, which is the second M. Moving on to the third M, which talks about which particular media vehicle to choose as a carrier of your advertisement. Fourth decision area pertains to the money that you want to spend on the entire advertising campaign, which comprises of the ad budget. And the last decision area relates to measuring the effectiveness of the ad campaign. We had already covered the first 3 decision areas, that is the decision pertaining to the advertising objectives, decision related to the media and the message strategy. Let us now move on to the 4th decision area, which is determination of the advertising budget. Now you know students that the companies, they spend large amount of money on their ad campaigns. It is very important for them to plan in advance as to how much money they want to spend on their advertising efforts. Also, at the end of the day, it becomes equally important for the firms to keep on assessing as to how much more money is required or how much money needs to be cut down from the previous budgetary plans in order to reassess their requirements on an ongoing basis. In this line, we would be talking about how a company or a firm can decide on the advertising budget. We know that budgeting is something which is very important because it is just like a plan. It is a plan of action which guides a firm as to how much money is required for the advertising efforts and how this money is to be readjusted, keeping in view the change in the objectives, keeping in view how much the ad campaign is working effectively for the furtherance of the goals of the advertiser. We at times see that the advertisers or the firms, they apply the rules of marginal analysis. You must have understood at some point of time that when we talk about marginal analysis, we try to see to what extent we can continue to spend money on our advertising efforts, and this we would be doing up till a level where we see that our spend, our advertising spend is actually giving revenues to the business. So long as my incremental revenues or the additional revenues which I foresee are going to happen as a result of my advertising efforts, they keep on exceeding the incremental cost which I would be incurring on my advertising, I will keep on spending the money. But as soon as a firm I figure out that my additional revenue is almost equal to the cost of advertising, or my advertising cost has exceeded my revenues, I will stop making any further advertising outlay. Also, I find that many times there is a law of diminishing returns which we find is applicable in economics is equally true for advertising also. Like initially we know that when we spend money on advertising, it takes some amount of time for that particular ad spend to get translated into sales revenue, or it would take some time before it helps us in the accomplishment of our goals. But we see that after a extent or beyond a point, we find that any further investment in my advertising efforts or any further expenditure that I undertake in terms of my advertising cost does not give me that kind of a value. So the value of my advertising starts going down as I spend more and more money on my advertising campaigns. Therefore, by and large, the firms basically adopt a strategy where either they go by the cost oriented methodology, or they go by the competitive oriented methodology, or they go by some sales model through which they can determine the amount that they would like to spend on their advertising outlay, or they go by the communication oriented strategies. And we will see one by one as to what kind of advertising budget one can come up with if we take into consideration these kind of approaches. When we start with the cost oriented methodology, we see that by and large the companies fall back on 4 basic methods. One is the affordability method. As it is very clear from the nomenclature, affordability methods basically hinge on the fact that you would be spending, or a firm would be spending, that much money on its advertising campaign as its pocket can allow, so as it can afford to spend. So it's say after taking into consideration all the other expenditures, after taking into consideration all the other kinds of costs which are involved at the end of the company, whatever would be left would be spent on the advertising efforts. Now obviously the advantage is that this is something which is very simple to adopt. There is also an advantage in the sense that you would be first of all taking care of all the other expenditures which are involved in an organization, and then whatever is left behind you would be spending it on your advertising efforts, assuming that this is something which is also important. But at the same time, this also becomes one of the limiting factors of this particular approach, because you do not assign that kind of importance to your advertising and promotional efforts as much probably that you assign to the other activities of the organization. Also, this becomes little lopsided in the sense that if there is more money that you have in your pocket, you end up spending more without rationalizing the very need or the purpose of that particular ad spend. On the contrary, it may so require that a particular period requires more advertising effort, but you do not have that kind of money in your pocket to spend on your campaign, and therefore you restrict yourself when it comes to the ad outlay. So let's say we therefore have to look for more realistic methods. The second method, which is by and large adopted by the firms following the cost oriented approach, is the arbitrary allocation method. So let's say you arbitrarily randomly allocate the money on your advertising efforts. Again, this is basically done by those small and medium sized companies who do not literally depend on advertising to do that kind of a job for them when it comes to the marketing of the products. The large companies, they have a more rational and realistic approach of determining their advertising budget. The third method basically relies on the break-even approach. Now what we do here, as I was talking about the marginal rule of analysis, you keep on spending the money on your advertising campaign so long as you feel that the revenues that you are going to get from that particular ad spend is going to exceed the cost that you are spending on your ad campaign. So the moment, just like in case of a break-even point, there is a status quo where your profit and loss is at par. So if you continue to produce more number of units, you end up moving towards the losing end. Similarly, if you continue to spend your money, which is more than the revenue that you foresee arising out of that particular ad campaign, it may not work. So break-even point is the point where you find that your incremental revenues being generated out of the ad campaign are probably more, they exceed the incremental cost of spending on your advertising efforts. The last method under the cost oriented approach relates to the percentage of sales method, which is whatever you have earned as your sales revenue in, say, the preceding quarter, a certain percentage of it or a sum of it you are going to set aside for your advertising efforts in the next quarter. That is, you are going to take your sales revenue as a benchmark, you are going to take your sales revenue as a base in order to decide how much money you want to spend on your advertising efforts. Now, the problem with this kind of a methodology is that you are creating a confusion when it comes to the relationship between advertising and sales revenue is concerned. That is, this method probably believes or assumes that sales is something which is giving you impetus for your advertising efforts. So, if the sales revenues are good enough and you set aside a certain percentage, fixed percentage of that particular sales revenue to give boost to your advertising plans in future, you are going to get good enough money. But if for any reason in a particular quarter the sales falls down and there is a less sale, and then you set aside a fixed percentage, there would be a lesser money that you would be having at your disposal to spend on your advertising campaign. So, it means I am relying on sales. It means advertising effort is then the outcome of the sales which I generate in the organization, which is actually not true. So, you incur your advertising cost because you want the sales to happen. It is not the other way around. So, you do not have the sales revenue and then you take out a fixed percentage in order to spend on your ad campaigns. Alternate version of this kind of an approach is where the firms take the sales revenue of the future period as a base or as a benchmark. So, let's say you have certain forecasted sales that you want to achieve in the next period or in the next quarter, and then you set aside a fixed percentage of it and you spend that kind of money on your advertising efforts. But then again, if we see that advertising is a sales objective, and we have actually discussed it in the first decision area where we talked about sales being a primary objective of any ad campaign. So, if we go by that particular premise that yes, the companies do invest a lot of money in their advertising efforts because they want the sales revenue to happen, then strictly going by the percentage of sales method in order to decide on your advertising outlay may make sense to a certain extent, but not completely. We now move on to the communication oriented approach, which also guide the advertisers and the firms in terms of setting their advertising outlay. The first aspect which one needs to consider here is that I am making a communication through my advertising efforts in order to bring out an impact in my target audience. So, let's say I would be spending that much amount of money on my advertising campaign as I feel is required in order to generate a probable impact on the attitude of my target audience. Now, when I talk about the impact on attitude, I know that this impact can be created at three levels. There can be a cognitive impact, there could be an affective impact, and there could be a cognitive impact. When I talk about cognition, I try to bring about some sort of an understanding, some sort of a learning, knowledge when it comes to my advertising campaign. So, my advertising campaign actually aims at bringing about certain degree of awareness or knowledge or learning with respect to the product or the service which is being advertised. At the second level, which I say is the affective level of attitude, I try to link my advertising campaigns in order to trigger certain emotions and feelings in my audience. So, let's say the whole purpose of advertising and the whole purpose of spending money is to create that kind of a bond in terms of the affective feelings. And at the third level, I say I am working at the behavioral level of attitude, where I want people to behave in terms of buying that particular product which they see being advertised. So, let's say I would be spending then logically the amount of money which is required in order to create any of these kind of impacts through my ad campaign. The advantage is that it helps in providing us with some sort of a realistic notion as to how much money is being spent and what is the real impact of that particular spend in terms of at what level of attitude that kind of money spent is making a impact so far as the target audience is concerned. Moving on to the next kind of an approach under the communication oriented strategy is related to the objective and the task method of setting the advertising budget. Now, this is considered to be the most objective form of determining your advertising outlay. The reason is that you break down your overall objectives into, say, subcomponents and subparts, or I can say you have a broader organizational objective, and then you have your marketing objective, then you have your advertising objective, and when you have your advertising objective, you decompose that advertising objectives into what all activities and what all tasks that an organization needs to perform in order to move closer to that advertising objectives accomplishment. So, let's say I have my advertising objective and a series of tasks and a series of activities which I need to perform in order to accomplish that advertising objective. For each task, then I would be making an assessment of how much money is required, and this is how I would be having a more logical estimation of my advertising budget which is required in order to move nearer to my overall advertising objective. So, as we see, the series of steps which are involved in your objective and task method of determining the ad outlay would involve: 1. Determining the advertising objective with utmost clarity, defining the variables which need to be measured. So, let's say I need to measure the awareness that I need to create, or say some other measures which are involved therein. I have to specify the various tasks and the activities which are involved in order to achieve that objective which I have listed in step 1. I have to determine the cost for each and every activity and each and every task. I have to conduct the programs, or I have to conduct the ad campaigns, and then I have to carry out a review or an evaluation in order to see whether I am spending in the right direction, whether more amount is required, whether less amount is required. So, say this is something which is more objectively done, and therefore this is something which is the most preferred method adopted by the firms and the companies in order to determine their advertising budget. Let us move on to the various factors which guide you at the end of the day. We know that we have seen the cost oriented method, and we have also seen the sales model. So, let's say what kind of sales I want to have, and therefore what kind of advertising budget I need to have in order to procure that level of sales. We've also seen that competition plays a very important role, and in some of the cases what you are going to spend at the end of the day is determined as to how much aggressive your competing firms are in terms of spending money on the advertising campaign. So, if they are spending more, you also end up spending more amount of money, because at the end of the day you have to combat competition. So, let's say, but then what comes out to be as a host mix of factors which are going to determine the amount of money that you have to keep aside as your advertising budget. This is something which is driven by multitude of factors. So, there is no one isolated factor which is going to govern the choice of any firm or the company. Rather, one has to take into account a holistic mix of the factors which may influence your budgetary decisions. They can be broken down into 4 heads, like some of them are product related factors, some of them are market related factors, some of them depend on how much frequently you need to advertise, some of them relate to the other piece of your marketing strategy, because we know that at the end of the day advertising is nothing but a very strongly used tool of promotion, and promotion is nothing but one of the piece of the marketing mix. So, in no way you can decide on your promotion strategy or your advertising strategy without taking into consideration how well it gels with the other 3 piece of your marketing mix. So, starting with the product related factors, we know that there are certain areas which one needs to take into consideration before setting your advertising budget, like what is the product life cycle stage. So, let's say we have generally seen that in the introductory stages of the PLC, or in probably the early growth stages of the PLC, you find companies focusing more on your advertising efforts, because this is the stage where you need to make people aware of your product offerings. As you move along the product life cycle and you reach a peak in your growth stage, and you are into a mature stage of your PLC, you find that there is a sudden shift, there is a transition in terms of how much you would be spending on advertising vis-a-vis the other tools of promotion. So, we see that it is generally in the maturity and the decline stage that sales promotion schemes take an edge over the advertising efforts. Though we see that the companies on a continuous basis keep spending money on their advertising efforts and they actually advertise on a continuous fashion, but the intensity with which they would be doing their ad campaigns and the intensity with which they would be spending money on their ad efforts certainly is something which they would keep on rationalizing on the basis of their movement of the product across the PLC. We also see that there are certain market related factors like what is the nature of demand and how much nature of demand you want to grow. So it's basically you want to stimulate that demand and you want people to ask for your product, and they are going to do that only when they know that such kind of product exists in the market, for which they need information, and the advertisement is something which is very handy in terms of providing that information to the TG. We also know that nature of competition plays a very important role. So if in a particular sector, if in a particular industry, the competition is very intense, it is very severe, obviously it requires more effort at the end of a particular company in order to compete with so many rival firms. So you need to be more aggressive in your strategy, you need to be more vocal, you need to be heard more, and therefore you have to spend more on your advertising efforts. Also we see that there is certain kind of objective that you have in mind before you choose your ad campaign. So let's say the objectives with which your campaign would be driven also calls for rationalizing as to how much money you would be spending in your advertising efforts. So let's say initially when you need to make people aware, probably a more advertising budget is to be set aside, but in the later stage it is only the reminder advertising which is required, and therefore probably one can cut down on the ad spend in the subsequent stages, all depending on what kind of objective you want your advertising campaign to do for you. Also we have certain other uncontrollable environmental factors, like all of a sudden there is something happening in the economy, there is a boom or there is a depression period, people may be projecting a different kind of a propensity to consume or a propensity to save, and therefore your campaigns have to be adjusted in the light of the macro environmental forces over which the firms and the companies have either very little control or no control, and therefore my advertising budget also may keep on changing, varying depending on what are the changes which I foresee in the environment, and therefore how I have to adapt my advertising strategy in order to cater to those changes which are happening in the environment, so that I can turn them into an opportunity. So these were some of the factors which are going to affect my overall budgeting decisions at the end of the day. Students, let us see that how after making all these decisions related to how much one needs to spend, crafting a very good message strategy, working on your media vehicle, still at the end of the day, unless and until I am able to track the performance of my advertising campaign, the things are not going to make much sense. So this takes us to the next major decision area relating to measuring the advertising effectiveness. So we'd say this is also known as measurement. So we'd say which is the fifth M which is involved in advertising. Now what are basically the decisions involved? The decisions involved are why. So let's say why I need to measure the performance of my ad campaign. Second is where do I need to do that? When do I need to do it? Which particular measures and methods that I can use in order to track the performance of my ad campaigns, and we are going to look at these sub-components one by one. So starting from why to measure. So let's say why do you think it is important for the companies to track the performance of their ad campaigns? So let's say the first logical reason is because you don't want to make the same mistakes again in future. So you want to avoid costly mistakes. When the company or when the firm is spending crores of money in their ad campaign, it becomes justifiable at their end to keep a track of how well the money spent is doing when it comes to the accomplishment of advertising objectives. So let's say you have to evaluate the alternate strategies also from time to time. So let's say people are also looking for a change, the consumers are also looking for a change. There is so much happening in say the environment outside the organization. So in order to keep abreast with all the changes which keep on happening, one needs to incorporate the changes in the advertising strategy also, and all this change requires that you revisit as to what you have done in the campaign so far and what kind of changes are required in the future campaigns by the company. There is also an increase in you can say the amount of money that people are spending or the firms are spending in their advertising efforts in general, because they have understood over the years that this is something which is a very, very important tool of promotion, and a whole lot of it depends on how a particular kind of an image and the reputation and the goodwill of the company is getting created in the eyes of the consumers through the ad campaign. So it's basically the advertising which is the face of the company in terms that it is doing that kind of a communication with the TG. So it's the communication has to be right, and if at any point of time you feel that the things are not moving in the right direction, you can stop it there and then, and you can make some corrective changes in your advertising efforts so as to have a better connect with your target audience. We also need to see that yes, the objectives are met and we are moving closer to the accomplishment of our goals. As you see in case of organization, the organization starts with the planning stage and it ends with the control stage. So it's the planning gives you a course of action, and then there is an execution and implementation, and towards the end you try to see to what extent you have bridged the gap between where you were and where you are at the end of the day. So similarly, where the setting up of your goals and setting aside of the money helps you in giving you a plan and a course of action, and then you execute it with the help of your message strategies and your media strategies, it makes sense that the cycle will not be complete unless and until you exercise a control mechanism also in advertising, and this control mechanism is actually exercised through the measurement of the advertising effectiveness. So you have various things to measure, and you have various other decision areas to take care of as to what you have to measure. Is it the communication effort that you want to measure, or is it the sales effort that you want to measure? And unless and until you measure and you track the performance of your advertising efforts, one cannot actually know as to whether you are spending money in the right direction or it is all going waste. So students, we will in the next session see in detail as to what are the other subcomponents of measuring the advertising effectiveness and what are the various methods through which the companies can gauge the performance of their advertising campaigns. Thank you. Okay students, so let us learn more about how to measure the advertising effectiveness. There are certain decision areas which are involved, like why do the companies and the firms need to measure the effectiveness of their ad campaigns, what needs to be measured, when do they need to measure it, where do they need to measure it, and what kind of methods one can adopt in order to do this kind of an advertising test. Now let us start from why to measure. We know that companies spend a lot of money in their advertising campaigns, and therefore it makes sense that they track it from time to time as to how much their advertising efforts is helping them in moving closer to their goals. Also, one has to devise the alternate strategies over a period of time, given the fact that business is dynamic and ever changing. There are a lot of changes which take place in the external environment also, and one has to adapt the advertising strategy, or so to say the broader promotional strategy, in the light of the changes which take place in the supra system. So it makes more sense that I keep on tracking as to how well my ad campaigns are doing and what kind of changes are required, so that I can tap those changes and I can change and I can convert them into opportunities for my organization. Also, there has been an increasing reliance and importance of advertising, which the companies have addressed, and they have realized over the years that advertising has that kind of a power to make the brand, and in order to create a good image of the company. We also have to determine if the objectives that we had set in the plans initially are being accomplished by the firms through the advertising efforts, or we need to rework on the advertising objectives and we need to rework on our advertising strategies. So in order to make all this trackable and in order to have the money spent which is more logical, and the money spent which actually helps the organization to move closer to its advertising objective at the end of the day, is something that we are looking at. And let us start as to what all needs to be measured. So let's say when I am going for the testing part of my advertising program, I need to test both the communication effect and the sales effect. Students, I would here take you back to that area where we had begun the discussion by saying that advertisers have to set aside an amount of money, keeping in mind the broader advertising objective that they want to pursue. Now say my ad objective would be sales at the end of the day, but then we have also seen that advertising is not only about sales. There are certain other response variables, the intervening response variables, which we had covered under the hierarchy of effects model, which say that advertisers aim at going step by step from accomplishing one communication objective to the other communication objective. And these communication objectives are nothing but the intervening response variables, such as creating awareness, creating interest, creating desire, creating action, and so on and so forth. So we'd say that the advertising program, the overall evaluation of it would be complete when I'm going to test both how well my advertisement campaign has done when it comes to accomplishment of my communication goals, and at the same time how well it has done when it comes to bringing the sales for my organization is concerned. So when I talk about the communication effect, I am going to test the copy part of it. So let's say how well people knew about my product or my brand before getting exposed to the advertisement, and how much aware they are and how much interested they are in buying my product after being exposed to the advertisement. Whereas when it comes to the sales effect, I am going to gauge the difference between what were my sales figure and how much revenue I was earning before the ad exposure and how much money I am making after the ad exposure. So what is the difference in the sales and how trackable that thing is to advertising. That is how much of it I can attribute to my advertising efforts. Let us see when to measure. So, say this is a big important question as to when I should do this. I can do it in a pre-phase also and in a post phase also, which means that I can do a certain amount of test when I am just about to launch my campaign, and I can do certain kind of test in order to see how my campaign has done afterwards. So, it's some of the companies do a pre-testing because they don't want to take any risk. So, or they want to mitigate their losses, or they want to mitigate their risk in the form that they want to be sure that yes, the copy with which they would be moving ahead with, or the vehicle that they would be using at the end of the day, is something which would be accepted well by the TG. So, I don't want to take any chance, and it is better that I move with a pre-testing stage. However, the pre-test do not give you a surety that everything is going to work well. There are instances where the companies have gone in for pre-testing, yet the campaigns have failed to make an impact. But it is always better, and it guards you against all sorts of problems and risk which an advertiser may be taking or a company may be taking if you skip this pre-test stage and go ahead with the launch of the ad campaign. At the same time, the post-test also gives you very important information, though it is the post-mortem of the analysis of what has already been done. So, people are already exposed to that particular advertisement, but it helps you in identifying the problem areas so that you can address those problem areas in your future ad campaigns and come up with, say, more corrective form of advertising. We would say when to measure. So, say there could be 2-3 stages as to you can measure your ad effectiveness in the laboratory kind of a setting, or you can do it in a, say, field kind of a setting. So, it depends as to what kind of things you want to measure and whether you are doing it in a pre-test stage or a post-test stage, which will help you in order to decide whether you want to have a laboratory kind of a setting, or you want to go on to the field, or you want to approach the consumers and the TG in their households in order to do that kind of a testing. Which methods to use? So, there obviously would be a basket of methods and the measures which a company can use in order to do that. Let us first understand what can be the measures. So, what all I need to measure. So, what could be the metrics. So, metrics is I want to know when it comes to, say, the print media, how well the copy is being written. Is the language clearly understandable? Do I need to work on my appeal? Do I need to change the theme? Do I need to put in more illustrations? So, is it coming out to be something which is impactful, something which is drawing the attention of the TG or not? It could be something related to the, say, effectiveness of the vehicle or the carrier. So, I choose a print media as a broader classification of the media that I would want to use for my ad campaign, but within the print, am I using the right kind of print media? That is, if I am going on for the newspaper, is it the right kind of newspaper, or the magazine, is it the right kind of magazine, and so on and so forth. So, what should be the mix of the media and what should be the ultimate carrier of my advertising message, and have I zeroed on to a right carrier of my advertising message or not? Similarly, there could be tests related to my recall and recognition. So, how much people are able to recall and recognize having seen that particular ad sometime in the past in whatever platform it was aired in. So, these are some kind of metrics which will help me in figuring out as to whether my advertising is moving in the right direction and is it making that kind of a rightful impact which the advertiser is aiming at or not. So, some of the methods that you can use it both in the pre-test stage also and in the post-test stage also are like the consumer jury. So, just like you have a panel of judges, you can have a panel of consumers, and you can have focus group interviews, and you can have focus group discussions where you have a set of consumers and you have a, say, group of consumers who would be deliberating on how effective they find the ads. You can also show one ad in the pre-test stage, or you can show couple of ads or a basket of ads because you want to see as to which particular copy part seems more effective to them, and which particular copy you should move ahead with in your final launch of the ad campaign. There could be some of the ways in which this could be done, like I've already mentioned the focus groups or the interviews or say the questionnaire method. So you can also have in your pre-test or a post-test stage a list of questions that you would be asking the consumers regarding the advertisements which they would be exposed to later on when the ad is launched on a nationwide basis, or what is their feeling or how much is the positive change in the attitude or positive change in the behavior as a result of their being exposed to that particular ad campaign. In some of the cases, we also find that the advertisers make use of certain mechanical devices in order to gauge the effectiveness of the advertisements. In some of the cases, what we want to measure is something which is abstract, something which is subjective, and therefore I cannot quantify it literally if I ask the consumers to directly tell me about certain aspects of the advertisements, like for example emotions. So I have come up with a very emotional kind of a copy for my advertisements. So if I directly want to know to what extent my exposure to the ad is triggering those emotions in people, probably I won't be getting those kind of direct or right answers. So I have to adopt certain other methodologies, like taking the aid of the mechanical devices in order to measure to what extent people are feeling emotions and a right set of emotions after being exposed to my ad campaign. So there could be, say in case of print, there could be eye tracking devices, there could be say measurement of the pulse. I need to measure how much the pupils get dilated when I am exposed to an emotional ad. So let's say these are some of the things which probably could not be tapped on, could not be measured if I make use of more direct methodologies like the focus groups or say the questionnaires, and one has to resort to probably a mix of these things along with certain mechanical devices in order to have an idea as to how well the campaign has done or is having that kind of probability of doing well in future if it is aired. Let us come to the essentials of the copy testing or the essentials of the effective testing. So let's say even though when you use a healthy mix of say the metrics and the methods that you want to use in order to test the effectiveness of the campaign, one has to move in a logical manner. Like it is always helpful if you establish your communication objectives, because then you know that what all you need to track. Now, you know, students, we have seen that the advertisers need to measure both the communication effect of their advertising and the sales effect of their advertising. Now, sales effect is something which is still easy to measure and easy to track. Why? Because you would be having the sales figure of the prior period also and the sales figure of the post advertisement period also, and you can match them and compare them and see. And if other things are constant and if there is no big change that you have introduced in your marketing mix strategy or the other strategy of the organization, you can fairly attribute that particular change in sales to your advertising efforts. But tracking the communication objective is not that simple, and therefore if you have your communication objective clearly listed out, it would be very helpful. So let's say I know that my communication objective is to create brand awareness, and therefore after a certain period of time, say 2 months, 3 months of airing of the campaign, I would now like to see to what extent my copy has aided in bringing out that awareness for my group of TG. Similarly, it is always better if you use a consumer response model. Again, when I talk about consumer response model, I am basically referring to the hierarchy of effects model. So let's say I know my model and the stage at which I am currently at and the stage where I want to be. So let's say the simplest being ADA, starting from attention to interest to desire to action. So let's say I am now at the interest stage, and slowly and gradually I would, through my communication efforts, through my advertising efforts, I would want my people to move from my stage of feeling interested in the brand or having a desire to own that particular brand to finally taking an action, moving on to the last action stage and buying that particular product. And therefore after a 3-month period or after a stipulated period, I would like to figure out as to what extent people have eventually moved from being in the interested stage to the action stage. So let's say I can use both the pre-test and the post-test, there is a certain things which pre-test tell me, and therefore it helps me in making those kind of mistakes in the final campaign. Similarly, post-test helps me to take a certain kind of a corrective advertising. I can use multiple measures. So, let us not fall back on a very straightforward single measure in order to gauge the performance of my ad campaigns. Rather than doing that, I can have a healthy mix of methods in order to give me a more confident idea as to how well my entire campaign has done. And then towards the end, I have to understand and implement the proper research. There are certain things that I have to know about the consumers. There are certain things that I need to know about the markets also. There are certain things that I may need to know about my competitors also. So it's a holistic mix which is going to tell me that yes, my advertising has done fairly well up till this particular extent, and this is something which again needs to be handled with more caution, with more research in my future campaigns. But all said and done, we know that this is not something which is very easy to accomplish. The reason is that there are certain impediments. There may be certain problems which the advertisers may find very difficult to handle. Like, for example, the cost part. I know that measuring is something which is very important, but the firms have to have that kind of money in their pocket to keep on measuring the effectiveness of their campaigns. Research itself is a problematic area. So you at times need to rope in the market research firms or the syndicate research agencies to give you that kind of data. So it's a whole body of research. We can say that this is something which falls in the line of advertising research. So I need to research a lot in terms of how well my campaign has done, what are the problems. So I have to define the problem areas, or I have to take a complete study in order to understand what the campaign was, what were the objectives were, and to what extent my campaign has helped me in achieving those things. There is often also a disagreement as to what exactly needs to be measured, when it is need to be measured, how it needs to be measured, and that kind of a confusion between the advertisers and the agencies and the clients pose a certain degree of impediments when it comes to tracking the performance of the advertisement. So if I do not have a very clear-cut idea as to what I want to measure, it would be difficult for me to proceed with the whole process. And this is the very reason why I have stated some of the essentials of the advertising effectiveness, where I say that it is very important for you to understand what your objectives were, what was your response model, what you wanted from the campaign. So unless and until you are very clear on what you wanted, you just cannot begin with an assessment of how well the job has been accomplished. And the last is that there are certain objections of the creative, that is the agency also. So when you start tracking the performance, the agencies feel that probably it is the reflection of the performance of the agencies, and they don't want to take that kind of a responsibility if something goes wrong. So they object to the overall performance. But given the fact that the companies are spending a lot of money and they really know that a lot of it depends on the success of the ad campaigns, they want that money to move in the right direction and do something good for the company. And therefore, this is something which ends up becoming a very vital step of the overall advertising process. Let us talk about what then can be an ideal campaign. So after having looked at the various aspects of the decision areas involved in the campaign, right from determination of the objectives to deciding about the media strategy, deciding about the message strategy, the copy, the theme, illustrations, writing for the various platforms, having certain advertising budget that the company would be keeping aside, measuring and tracking the performance after the regular time period. We say, what can an ideal ad campaign do for the firm, or what should it be doing for the firm or the company? So we'd say the right consumer is basically exposed to the message at the right time and place, and this is what the good ad campaign does for the organization. The ad actually causes the consumers to pay attention to lot many things. So let's say there are certain aspects of the information which the company fails to provide or do not find any other way to deliver that information other than the ad. So let's say the ad therefore brings the attention of the consumer right to what the company wants to communicate. The ad also reflects the consumer's level of say understanding. So let's say you get to understand the consumers better. Why? Because through the ad campaign and through the tracking of the performance of the ad campaign, you can reflect on how well the members of your TG are moving from one stage of their hierarchy of effects to the other stage of the hierarchy of effects. So if you can logically track the movement of consumers from one stage of the response hierarchy to the other stage of the response hierarchy, it means that yes, my ad campaign is working and it is doing something. The ad also correctly positions the brand in a certain way and clearly outlines the points of differences and the points of similarity. So it's through the ad campaigns that many a times the consumers get to know the aspects on which probably two brands are similar or two brands are different. So it's in some of the ways advertising then becomes, or an ideal ad campaign then becomes, the focal point in terms of establishing the points of distinctions and the points of similarities between the various products and services which are there on offer in the market. The ad also motivates the consumers to consider the purchase of the brands. I say that it is not, advertising is not only about information. So it's informative advertising is only one category. We also have to look at the other broad categories like persuasive advertising. So advertising is all about providing that persuasion, providing that motivation, providing that urge and impetus to the consumers to buy that particular product, and now and then every time talking about how my particular brand is better and is actually going to solve your problem in a better manner in comparison to what the competing rival firms have to offer. So it's the advertising therefore motivates the consumer to take and address all those problems, the solution of which lies in the purchase of the product. Also, we know that the ad creates strong brand associations. So let's say you over a period of time start associating brands with their communication strategy, and therefore they go a long way in not only creating a good market for the product and helping an advertiser in grabbing a bigger market share, but also helps in placing your product at a little higher level in comparison to the competing firms. But the advertisement obviously is not and cannot be the solution to all the problems. In fact, advertising is only one of the tools of promotion. So if you feel that at any point of time the solution lies in your advertising campaigns or the solution lies in crafting a good advertising message, this is not right. So there are certain things which the advertisements cannot achieve, and some of these aspects are that advertising cannot sell an overpriced and a non-competitive product. So simply people do not want to buy a product because there is something wrong with the pricing strategy, there is something that they feel is lacking in the product when they compare it with the competitive offerings which are available in the market. Just having a very good advertisement is not going to work. So people may like your advertisement a lot. People may like to see your advertisement, listen to your advertisement, and this is where it ends. But when it comes to moving the consumers from that particular stage of awareness and liking for the advertisement towards the purchase of the brand, this is not going to happen, because the problem is not with the campaign, the problem is somewhere else. The problem is in some of the other P that the firm then needs to address, like it could be pricing, it could be distribution, it could be product, or so on and so forth. So similarly the advertisement cannot sell a bad product twice. So if there is something which is inherently wrong in the product fails to meet the expectations of the consumer in terms of its quality, in terms of its functionality, in terms of its pricing, no amount of advertisement can actually help you with the sale and marketing. You cannot sell a poorly distributed product. So you have to provide that kind of things in a balanced form when you craft your overall marketing strategy, keeping into consideration the fact that advertising is only one of the domains that you are handling, but that particular domain or that particular area cannot give you solutions to the problems which are there in the other piece of the marketing strategy. or you cannot sell the products to the person who do not have any use of it. Now here I would like to mention something very interesting. Advertising is often attacked on the grounds that it creates the needs when there are none. So people can actually do without all those products which are by and large advertised. It gives you an idea as to buying those kind of products are an absolute must for the consumers. They help you to like aspire for certain things in life, improve your standard of living. You also have a wishful thinking when it comes to that kind of a lifestyle which is being advertised with respect to certain products and services in the market. And this is one side where advertisement is often criticized. But at the same time, we also understand that even if these things are there, you cannot make people buy something for which there is no need at all. So it is basically the role of the entire marketing mix, starting from say establishing the need of the product, and first of all understanding that yes, the consumers need that particular product in order to have that kind of satisfaction which they expect the product to deliver. The entire marketing strategy actually revolves around all these things. So it is not the selling part which your advertisement campaign is doing, and one needs to understand that yes, advertising has a power to take your product and your brand or your company to a certain level, but if you expect that the advertisement is going to help you in selling whatever you want to sell to the marketplace, this is something which is not going to happen. So there has to be a lot of compatibility that one has to go for before you expect your advertising campaign to work, in the sense that you want the advertising campaign to at the end of the day show you certain response, show you certain results, and those results could be in n number of ways. It could be in terms of change in sales which you can find, it could be in terms of people becoming more aware, it could be in terms of rekindling the interest in the brand, it could be in terms of recommending that particular kind of a product to others, it could be as simple as just dealing with the crisis kind of a situation by communicating and by establishing your viewpoint with the TG is concerned. So we'd say the advertising therefore at the end of the day can play diverse roles. It can start from providing the information to persuading you to buy that particular product, and may end up with a reminder kind of an advertising where every now and then you would be coming over and you would be talking about your product, and you would be also very clearly and rationally presenting the ways in which your product has a differentiation, has a differentiation edge over the other rival firms, and therefore you are giving enough information and enough reason for the consumers to then exercise their own wisdom in terms of deciding whether they want to buy that particular product or not. So let's say you can track the advertising performance over a period of time to see what advertising is doing for you, and this is something for which one needs to clearly understand what can be the probable things which the advertisement campaign can do for you, setting aside those objectives which are in line with what is achievable through advertising, and then tracking it at logical intervals of time to see to what extent advertisements have helped you in achieving those goals. So students, I hope that at the end of this lecture you would be having a good understanding of what advertising is. In the next session on advertising, we would be looking at the role of the advertising agencies and also some of the social, ethical and the regulatory aspects which govern advertisements in an Indian context. Thank you.
With this note, thank you ma'am. Thank you so very much for delivering us a very, very productive session, and dear friends, we believe that your feedbacks are very, very crucial for us. So do write to us at info.cec@nic.in if you have any queries, or if you want to give your feedback for this particular lecture. And all the lecture pertaining to the series on marketing management are there for you on YouTube. So keep watching us, keep writing us. We would be meeting again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you ma'am. Thank you once again.